Hello everybody. Today we are going to see your first chapter of economics, that is graphs in economics. Now we all know how graphs are useful in our daily life. How graphs helps us to understand the concept easily. Now this chapter deals with various types of graphs that you must have studied in your lower classes. Now, as before we start this chapter, let us understand the meaning of what is diagram, what is graph. Because generally we use two types of pictures to show information, that is diagrams and graphs. Now if we see the definition of diagram, it says that diagram is a representation of observable data by way of a picture. Scales and measurements are used while drawing a diagram, though through knowledge of statistics is not required to draw. Now, when we are drawing a diagram is actually, it is the representation of data, representation of information by way of pictures. You can draw pictures, that is pictograph is also a diagram. We are using pictures, we are using some symbols to represent our information, that is the diagram. But we use some scales and measurements. We follow some measurements to draw the diagram. But knowledge of statistics is not required. A person who doesn't have knowledge of statistics, statistical tools, doesn't matter. Simple person also, a layman also can draw a diagram to give the information. A diagram is drawn for data which is presented in discrete frequency distribution. In other words, we say a diagram is drawn for self-explanatory data, and laypersons do not require detailed knowledge of statistics in order to draw or understand a diagram. A layperson means a common man who doesn't have knowledge of statistics, who doesn't have knowledge of statistical tools, statistical formulae. Doesn't matter. Any person can draw a diagram. A diagram is used by advertising companies to draw attention, by the government to provide information, and by social organization to spread awareness. So diagrams are used by anybody. It can be used by any company. Nowadays, advertising companies, they use different types of diagrams to attract the attention of the customers. Even government also uses diagram to provide some information. Any organization, be it social, economical, whatever organization it is, everybody use diagram to give a message, to spread awareness. Then we have graph. Now graph is different from diagram. Graph says that a graph is also a representation of observable data by way of picture, but graph is drawn for statistical information which is not self-explanatory. Now when you are drawing a graph, you have to use some statistical information. You have to use some statistical tools, because graph is drawn to give statistical information. You need to have some basic knowledge of statistics to draw a graph. Next it says a graph is drawn for data with continuous frequency distribution. That is, use of statistical tools is made. In graph, you have to use statistical method, that is, you have to use some formula of statistics to draw a graph. A graph is also drawn for other types of complex statistical information also. So thorough knowledge of statistics is essential to draw and understand a graph. A graph can extend over one or more of the four quadrants obtained by the intersection of x and y axis on a plane, and it cannot be drawn without taking appropriate measurement. Now, if you have to draw a graph, you need to have knowledge of statistics. You need to have some ideas of statistics. You need to know some formulae of statistics. Then only you can draw a graph. And when you are making quadrants, when we on the graph paper, when you make x-axis and y-axis, four quadrants are formed. Quadrant 1, quadrant 2, quadrant 3, and quadrant 4. So these quadrants can be made without these quadrants cannot be made without proper measurement. So when you are making a graph, you have to follow perfect measurement. A graph is drawn on a paper. Now, graphs are used more by researchers and educationists. Graphs are not used for conveying information to general public. Now, if you present a graph in front of a layman, a common man, a person who doesn't have knowledge of statistics, he won't understand graph. So graphs are presented to those who knows statistics. Now, for example, we will take one table 1.1. It shows example of data with discrete frequency distribution. Now it's a discrete means discontinued frequency distribution. You see, price is given to you 1, 2, 5, it is increasing, and demand is decreasing, right? But if we talk about continuous frequency distribution, it shows the value income class from 10,000 to 20,000, number of people are 500. From 20,000 to 30,000, number of people are 300. From 30,000 to 40,000, number of people are 100. Likewise, if you see the classes of marks 10 to 19, there are 50 students. 20 to 29, there are 30 students. And 30 to 39, there are 10 students. So this type of information is called continuous frequency. And the previous one, this is called as discrete or discontinued frequency. Okay. This you must have studied in your statistics in the lower classes. Now we have to understand what is the importance of graphs and diagrams in economics. Now graphs and diagrams we are basically drawing in statistics. But why we have to study this chapter in economics? That is very important to understand. Now first it says that the first point says that the study of the object of economics, which is perceived as difficult and complicated, is made easier by way of diagrams and less confusing by way of graphs. Now, in economics, there are many topics which seems to be complicated and difficult when you read them. But when the same information you present through diagrams or through graphs, it becomes very easy to understand and it becomes very clear. So diagrams and graphs are used to study the complicated topics in economics, because by presenting the topics through diagrams and graphs, it makes it easy to understand. Second point says, trends of certain economic parameters over various years can be observed through a single diagram or graph. Now, trends of certain economic parameters means every year there are some changes. There are many changes that takes place in our economy, right? Example, population increasing, production increasing, decreasing, income increasing, decreasing. So there is a trend of change. There is a trend in the economic parameters. Now this trend or now these changes, fluctuations, if you want to explain to people, if you want to explain to some known person, if we write in paragraph, it won't be easy for them to understand. So when you present the information through diagrams and graphs, it makes very easy for them to understand what is the change. If you are taking 5 years data, in 5 years, what has happened from 2015 to 2020 in India? What is the population? So through diagram and graph, if you present the information, it is easy to understand rather than writing in paragraphs. Third point says, changes occurring in various sectors of the economy can also be easily understood. Now we know there are 3 sectors in the economy, right? Primary, secondary, and tertiary. So if you want to study the changes that has taken place over a different period of time, so we can use graph and diagram to present the information, because it will help us to understand it very easily. Fourth point says, a comparison can be easily drawn for the distribution of some economic parameters between group, class, region, sectors, as well as time periods. Now, when we are presenting the information through graph or diagram, we can easily compare. So comparison can be drawn. We can compare the information with other information through graphs and diagrams. So comparison is possible. Fifth point says, When many aspects of economics which are found apparently difficult are presented through diagram or graph, the time and effort of the presenter in explaining and of the reader in understanding this aspect is saved. Now, information which is very important for the people to understand, if that information we present through graphs and diagrams, so the person who is presenting the information, his effort and his time is saved, because just by presenting the information in graph and diagram, people when they see, they can easily understand. So the time of presenting, the time of presenter and the reader is saved. Here both the person, the one who is presenting the information, his time also is saved, and second, the one who is reading the information, his time also is saved, because just by seeing the graph, just by seeing the data, just by seeing the diagram, we can understand what is the information it is trying to give. Time is saved. Sixth point is, certain difficult principles of economics are easy to understand with the help of diagrams and graphs. For example, the concept of expansion and contraction of demand and supply, price elasticity of demand and supply are made easier by way of pictures, and the trends of the macroeconomics parameters can be clarified by way of time series graphs. Now, in microeconomics, there are many topics called as demand and supply, expansion and contraction of demand. So these kind of topics, if we explain verbally or through paragraphs, it is quite difficult to understand. But the same topics, when we present through the way of diagrams and graph, the interpreter, the reader of the information finds it very easy to understand. Just by seeing the graph, he can understand the information that is being presented. Also in macroeconomics, we have different parameters. So we use time series graph, we use various methods to show the information. Like example, the short run and long run irregular fluctuations in agriculture or the regular fluctuations in some industries can be calculated by the method of time series graph. So different information can be presented, whether it is microeconomics or macroeconomics. Graphs are very helpful for understanding the information. Then, as we are drawing the graph, we need to keep some points in our mind. The first point says that choice of type of diagram or graph and their presentation. Before we start making the diagram or graph, we have to understand which graph or which diagram we have to select. The right type of diagram or graph must be chosen to make a picture more effective. Certain data can be presented in bar graph, bar diagram, and some are in pie diagram, right? So we are the user, we are the presenter. So we should first of all decide what type of information we have to present. Based upon the information, we have to select the diagram. Which diagram will suit our data? Which diagram will be helpful to present our data? So choice of choosing the diagram or graph is very important. Second point says clarity. Now clarity means the picture that you are presenting, the diagram that you are drawing, the graph that you are making should be very neat and clear. It should be very clear, very neat, proper. You can use different colors, you can use different shades to show the information. Coloring, shading, right? That can be used to talk about the information very precisely. Third point says scale and measure. Scale and measure means to make a picture look appropriate in size, scale must be taken in accordance with the data. Scale means your measurement. Like when you are drawing a graph, you should take proper measurement, 1 centimeter gap, 2 centimeter gap. So every time in between the graphs, the scale should be same. Proper scale measurement has to be taken so that your graph or your diagram will be appropriate. Fourth point says representation of axis. Now in bar graph, when we draw a graph, bar graph, we have x-axis and y-axis, right? So on x-axis we present some information and on y-axis we present another information. So the fourth point says both axes of diagram or graph must be denoted or represented with appropriate details of what they represent. So on x-axis, what information we are presenting, we have to write its name below it. On y-axis, what we are presenting, we have to write the name. Means, for example, on x-axis, if you are writing years, 1920, 1930, 1940, or 2010, 2012, 2014, 2016. These years we are presenting on x-axis. So down we have to write years. On y-axis, if we are presenting production, so we have to write production, that is 100, 200, 250, 300. So the information what we are writing on the graph, we have to write its name, what information we are showing. And the fifth point says data table and source of data. This is very important. Before making graph or before making a diagram, data table has to be made. A table should know, or the table should show the values that you have used to make a graph. Diagrams and graph must be accompanied by the data table from which they are created. Right? So data table is very important before you make a graph. Sixth point says method of calculating the data. Now there are sometimes it so happens that when you make a bar graph, you need to use some calculating methods. You need to use some statistical method to present your data. In this situation, after the graph is drawn down, you have to explain what method you have used to calculate the values. Sometimes the graph has some complicated data which you have presented. Now, as you have presented the data in graph, you know what method you have used to calculate the values. So that method, after the graph is done, you have to explain which method you have used, and you have to show the explanation as how you have got the values, those values which you have put in graph. So when you show the method of calculating the data, the person who is reading that information will easily understand. Now, the next topic says there are many types of diagrams that we use in statistics. Pictogram, scatter diagram, line diagram, circle diagram, bar diagram, pie diagram. These topics are not there for you in all these topics are not there. Hardly you have some 2 or 3 topics for your syllabus. All these topics are we all use these topics for our day-to-day presentation in statistics. Now we have to see what is time-based line diagram. Now time-based line, you can see one picture over here. Time-based line diagram is drawn like this. It's a curve, you can say, right? Now this is called as x-axis, this is called as y-axis. Okay, as I was telling you, you have to write what information x-axis is showing. So x-axis is showing time period. See, you can see over here time period. And what information y-axis is showing? Y-axis is showing decadal growth rate of population in percentage. So you have to write down the information that is presented on x-axis and y-axis also, the names. So x-axis will have independent variables and y-axis will have dependent variable. These variables are called as independent variables. Independent means they are not dependent. And on y-axis, you have to present dependent variables, means these variables are dependent on years. So these are called as dependent variables which keeps on fluctuating, and these variables are fixed. All right. Now you can see in the table it shows decades, means every 10 years gap from 1951 to 61 you see the growth rate of population in percentage. So in 51 to 61 in 10 years 21.64% growth is there. Like that 61 to 71 24.8. Like that if you see all these years now we have plotted on graph. You see 1951 it comes to 21.64. So between 20 and 25 somewhere here we have 21.64. So 21.64 is here. Then 61 to 71 24.8. So 61 is here, 24 comes near 25. So you see 24.8 is here. Like that, you have to check the years and check the values on y-axis, and wherever the values fall, you have to keep a dot. And finally, when the values are ended, you have to take a scale and join all the dots, which will give you a curve. This is called as time-based line diagram, or you can also call it as a curve. Thank you very much.